Okay, so before we dive right in and start building out our environment, I want to take some time to talk about environment art conceptually and explain a little bit about how environment artists think about the spaces that they want to create. Environments are present in all storytelling mediums, from novels to film to games, but maybe you have asked yourself, why do they matter? After all, stories are about the characters and the actions that they take. Why do we even need to spend the time creating elaborate backgrounds for them? Now, the answer is context. Although characters are the highlight of any narrative experience, without context, their actions and stories are meaningless. Take this example here. We have our character, Squidward, but what can we tell about him without further context? Well, he appears to be calm, he's smiling, and he's wearing a hat. But without more information, we don't know where he is, what he is doing, or what he is thinking or feeling about the situation. Now, when we add our environment, suddenly this image tells a whole story. We have Squidward here. It's the same character drawing, but now we know where he is, an art classroom. We know what he is doing. He's teaching a class. And we know that he feels happy and maybe a little smug about it. So really, when you break down scenes, especially those in a visual medium, we can see that the environments are really doing a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to storytelling. Environments set the stage for the characters and put their personalities, relationships, and actions into context. So let's talk about how 3D environments are designed. Most scenes use what is known as modular design. The modular approach to environment design involves breaking down a scene into repeatable component parts. Now, this is done for efficiency, both for the artist, as less time is spent making bespoke pieces, and for the machine that it is being rendered on, as instancing the same object multiple times across a scene is more performant than rendering the same number of unique assets. Now, this example here is the CCA subway scene by Clinton Crumpler. And we can tell the scene is modular in its design because we have a lot of repeating elements here that are using the same 3D meshes and textures. And just to illustrate this, I've done a quick draw over of just a few of the repeating elements here. So we have everything highlighted in red is the same chair texture, everything in yellow is the same pole texture, the doors, the windows, the lights on the top, and so on. So when we break it down this way, we can see that this scene is actually very efficient in its design, as the artist only had to make one of each of these highlighted pieces and then just essentially copy and pasted them to build out the entirety of the scene. Let's look at another example here of some student work of a modular environment. Here, it is easier to see which elements repeat, such as the chairs, the arches in the back, the sconces on the wall, the flower pots. And we can also see from this image that this scene is somewhat large in scale for an interior. But here is the kit that comprised that opera house scene. 3D artists will typically make what is known as a kit, consisting of individual mesh pieces that either the same artist or a level designer in some cases will take and use to build out the final scene. As you can see, the kit here is quite small given the scale of the room. The entirety of it was built with just really a handful of mesh pieces. So even a large scene can be made up of relatively few modules if there is strong repetition in the scene and the modules are well planned. Let's look at another example here. This example is of a very simple modular scene made in Blender. We will not be recreating this scene exactly. However, this is probably the scale of what we will be working on during the course because our time is somewhat limited. If you want to continue to develop your scene after the course is over, you are encouraged to do so. However, a small finished scene is much better on a portfolio than a sweeping vista that is half finished. So just keep that in mind. Here are the modules that made up that last scene. For this course, especially if this is your first time making a complete scene Aim for no more than 50 individual mesh pieces. If you plan a scene that has many more pieces than this, I encourage you to think about ways you can limit the scope to something more achievable. For instance, if you want to do it like an entire village, that is great, but it's probably a little out of scope for an individual project, especially if you're more of a beginner. I recommend limiting it to a single building's interior or a narrow alleyway or something of that nature. You can always add more to your scene later if you want to expand, but just work on getting that vertical slice finished first. So let's quickly discuss the types of scenes. There are two major categories of environment scene, interior and exterior. Now, while these may be self-explanatory as to what they are, let's try to look at it through the lens of creating environment art. An interior, such as the example we have from Skyrim here, is an environment that is inside a building, a cave, or some other enclosed limited space. They tend to be smaller than the exteriors and somewhat easier to control the final look of. We also have exterior scenes, such as this one from Breath of the Wild. They are representative of the outside world. They make up the majority of space in open world games. Filling up vast exteriors is generally more advanced work that requires some special considerations depending on your goals for the scene. So let's talk about some of the considerations right now. The first thing to consider is scope. Scope is the most important aspect of project planning, as it is very easy to ambitiously plan a large-scale project only to experience burnout halfway through it and end up not finishing it. Exterior kits such as this one are typically a little bit bigger as there is more space to fill in an exterior scene. This kit is by Laertes Studios. It is the Cyberpunk Environment Pack and it is available on flippednormals.com. Interior kits are typically a little bit smaller, although this is not always the case, as a cluttered room with hundreds of unique objects would be a larger kit than an open vista with just a few tree or rock models. But it is generally easier to contain the scope of an interior scene because there is generally less space to fill. This kit is by Experience Points Studio. It is called The Lab, and it is also available on Flipped Normals. Now, the second thing we want to consider is draw distances. In interior scenes, typically all the objects are loaded at once because the scope of the scene is limited enough that everything can be rendered in real time without too much of a performance hit for the PC. However, it is not possible for computers to load every 3D object in a game at the same time. So developers have created a method for culling objects that are not visible to the camera in order to increase real-time rendering performance. This is highly effective for objects that are behind the camera, but when working with exteriors, having long sightlines, such as this one in this example, can mean that more objects need to be rendered onto the screen at the same time. Now, to combat the performance hit that this causes, developers will employ special techniques such as implementing LODs, which stands for levels of detail, to run the renderer more smoothly at a higher frame rate. So unless you are familiar with these techniques already, these types of scenes are best avoided if you're just starting out to creating environment art. This scene is from A Boy and His Kite. It is by Epic Games, and it is available for download on the Unreal Engine Marketplace. So the last thing that we really need to consider is lighting. Lighting differs dramatically based on whether you choose an interior or an exterior scene. Exterior scenes often use what is called a directional light to mimic the sun, whereas interiors are usually lit from sources within the scene itself, such as light bulbs and torches. Now, depending on your target platform, exteriors may require a dynamic lighting setup that allows the lighting to change from day to night. This is less of a concern in interior scenes. Now, with all of these things in mind, we are actually going to be creating an exterior scene for this course. Now, despite the fact that exterior scenes are slightly more advanced, I think we're all up to the challenge, and this course will cover the basics that would be applicable to an interior scene, but we're going to take a few extra steps to look at some exterior specific cases. So we are still going to limit the scope to something small and manageable for the sake of the course, but I highly encourage you, once you are done with the course, to continue to develop your scenes to make them your own, because that is really what is going to make them stand out. So here is how this course is going to break down. It's going to be project-based, so we will spend the entirety of the course working on a single scene from start to finish. The first thing we're going to do is going to be pre-production and planning. We're going to break down our concepts and our references into a modular design plan. We will then block out this design with simple shapes in Blender, and we will also, in this part, be going over some of the basics of Blender for those of you who are not familiar with it. And then from there, we will go on to add detail to our geometry with modeling. After that, we are going to apply materials and textures to those models. And finally, we're going to set up some basic lighting, and then we will talk about how to get those final portfolio-worthy renders. So that is the plan for the course. And in the next video, we are going to be talking about planning our scene. So let's get started.